If you've been watching the news recently, it's no secret that things aren't going well for Russian President Vladimir Putin. In fact, according to former CIA Chief of Russian Operations Steve Hall, Putin's troubles are mounting at breakneck speed, and they might just be enough to break the infamous dictator. In this video, let's take a look at some of Hall's predictions about what might happen in Ukraine and just how much trouble Russia and its leader are really in. To start with, let's consider firepower. It's hard to turn on a TV without seeing something about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky asking for more ammunition. For instance, there have been multiple high-profile stories about how Ukraine's air defenses are short on missiles, leading some to speculate that Russia's air force would finally gain control of the skies and crush Ukrainian resistance. But the truth was far less ominous. Ukrainians had simply stated that at the current burn rate of ammunition, they might run out in a few months, not right away. In much the same way, there have been multiple stories on Ukraine facing shortages of shells for its artillery and other systems like the HIMARS rockets. But what these reports don't capture is that Russia is having the same type of problems, just on a far larger scale. Russian ammunition shortages have become just as severe as those on the Ukrainian side. But unlike Ukraine, Russia does not have the same huge coalition of powerful and well-armed Western allies willing to send it more materiel. Instead, its allies are limited to Iran, Belarus, and, reportedly, South Africa, China, and a few others. To date, the main advantage Russia has had over Ukraine comes from its Soviet legacy. Modern Russia contains massive stockpiles of Soviet weaponry and equipment, left over from the enormous arms buildups of the Cold War. However, after more than a year of war in Ukraine, that stockpile is closer than ever to being depleted. One sign of this came several months ago when Ukraine announced that for the first time, it had achieved artillery parity with Russia. Throughout most of the conflict, Russia had fired more than 20 times the shells of Ukraine, but for the first time, they began firing the same volume of shells, substantially leveling the playing field. This was aided by HIMARS strikes and sabotage of ammunition depots far behind Russian lines, so that by early to mid-2023, Ukraine was outfiring Russia 6-1. As Hall has noted, I think the pattern that we've seen over this year, the first year of the Ukrainian war, has been the West very slowly, very cautiously, I think probably not to overwhelm Ukrainian logistics capabilities, ramping up the type of weaponry and ammunition that goes with that. The huge shift in firepower had a noticeable effect on Russia's attempted offensive operations. Due to the poor training, planning, and leadership of Russian ground troops, most of their operations during the war have been heavily reliant on huge artillery barrages. But once their overwhelming artillery superiority went away, it's probably unsurprising that Russian infantry and tank forces haven't fared very well. This is somewhat expected from a military made up of mainly green and poorly trained conscripts, where most of the professional soldiers are more interested in lining their own pockets than defending a homeland. Most of Russia's actual territorial gains since the start of the invasion last year have been achieved by the Wagner Group, a huge private military contractor run by close Putin confidant Yevgeny Prigozhin. Unlike most of the Russian armed forces, the Wagner Group is well trained and equipped, allowing them to avoid some of the most basic pitfalls like walking into endless ambushes or fighting with no boots. One of the Wagner Group's most successful, yet horrible strategies has been the use of prisoners from Russian detention centers and jails, promising them freedom if they can survive a tour fighting in Ukraine. Leaked documents and phone calls suggest that Prigozhin and Putin never had any intention of letting most of these prisoners back into Russian society. Instead, tactics show that they have used them over and over again in the so-called human wave attacks, which helped Russia retake the devastated city of Bakhmut. Wagner released thousands of these armed prisoners who threw themselves against Ukrainian positions and risked being shot by other Russian troops if they retreated. When the Ukrainians opened their lines and revealed their primary defenses, Wagner's regular units would then begin direct assaults on the weakest points, often expending huge amounts of artillery. This strategy proved to be highly effective, especially for a military with such little emphasis on preserving the lives of its own troops. In Bakhmut and several other locations, Ukraine was eventually pushed back due to this strategy, which resembled Russia's actions during the huge sieges of World War II. But Wagner remains not just reliant on prisoners, but also on the continual influx of supplies from Russia's defense ministry. While the group has purchased a substantial amount of its own equipment over the years, inside Ukraine it has proved to be heavily reliant on Russian resupply. to keep up the pressure on Ukraine. This has proved to be a significant weakness, and it could also mean the loss of Bakhmut and more valuable territory during the Ukrainian counteroffensive taking place this summer. Much of the issue has to do with the way that Russia, and Putin in particular, go about politics. One thing Hall has pointed out is that to keep his firm hold on power, Putin must ensure that none of his direct subordinates are too successful, or run the risk of being overthrown. To do so, he often sets elements of his own government against each other, with advisors and senior military planners competing, often viciously. This applies to Prigozhin too. The man, sometimes known as Putin's chef, experienced a meteoric rise to his current position. Despite private military contractors technically being against Russian law, Putin allowed Prigozhin to create Wagner, on the condition that the group be firmly loyal to Putin, not the Russian state. This formed the basis for Wagner's various interventions in Africa and the Middle East, where it expanded Putin's military reach, enriched Russian business interests, and left a trail of atrocities in its wake. Wagner's success launched Prigozhin into Putin's inner circle. This has not gone over well with other top Russian officials, such as Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Shoigu seems to believe that Prigozhin's ambitions and control over a private military are setting him up as the next head of the Russian military, or as Putin's personal successor. He may have reason to worry about his own job too, as Russia's military prowess under him has been less than stellar. Due to its enormous losses, the country is actually the #1 supplier of materiel to Ukraine, having abandoned roughly 500 since the start of its invasion. It has also lost advanced air defense systems and huge amounts of ammo. All this is a very bad look for Shoigu, and has led some to speculate about the reasons why Putin has dismissed multiple of his other top generals, but not Shoigu himself. One answer is that he has kept Shoigu in charge of the military because without Putin's support, Shoigu is a goner, and he knows it. Unlike the politically adept Prigozhin, Shoigu is an outsider to the corrupt ladder of Russian politics, having come up through the ranks from essentially nothing. Shoigu thus has few friends in Russia's top echelons and does not pose a real risk to Putin's power and control of the state. Ironically, his rise was also as a logistics officer, where he was able to skim or divert large amounts of money from defense projects. Some US military officials have even referred to him as responsible for dismantling much of Russia's capabilities. Prigozhin has also repeatedly attacked Shoigu for his failures in Ukraine, while at the same time pointing out that Wagner has achieved what he could not in places like Bakhmut. It would be easy for Putin to replace the somewhat unpopular Shoigu with Prigozhin, but doing so would potentially endanger Putin himself. Shoigu has also tried to push back from his position atop the Russian military command. He took credit for the capture of Soledar, a salt mining town which Wagner actually seems to have done most of the fighting for. Prigozhin actually took to social media to refute these claims and bash Shoigu, and just as Wagner was about to capture Bakhmut, it happened again. As Wagner troops were only miles from retaking the last of the town, Shoigu pulled their supplies just to hurt his rival. Now Russia's issues with supplies have compromised its entire war effort, and become a masterclass in how not to handle logistics. In response to Shoigu's actions in Bakhmut, Prigozhin took to social media once again, threatening to pull Wagner troops out of the area entirely, leaving the ineffective Russian military on its own. Obviously, this would have been a disaster, and made Ukraine's counter-offensive that much easier. Shoigu, of course, claimed that he was not manipulating supply lines, and that Wagner had actually received everything it had been promised. When Prigozhin took a stand and declared that he would pull out all Wagner troops from Bakhmut by May 10th, the supplies miraculously started flowing again, only to be reduced just days later. So is this just a petty personal struggle, or are Russia's supply issues really that bad? Well, it appears that things may actually be that disastrous, with personal rivalries like this being just one factor among many. While Russia's artillery and other heavy guns were firing almost non-stop last year, now they sit inactive for days at a time. This has allowed Ukrainian forces more opportunity to respond, and may be one reason why the counter-offensive began now. In Bakhmut, recent reports suggest that Ukraine is now advancing south of the city, along a salient about 4 miles deep, pushing Russian forces back. In part, this is possible thanks to the issues between Shoigu and Prigozhin, and due to the fact that Wagner has been doing the brunt of the fighting, while Russian troops secure its flanks. These flanking troops have been attempting to cut off the city for months, by capturing the main supply routes to Ukrainian positions. As Wagner closed in on the city and Ukrainian defenders were pushed back, the flank attacks have increased in frequency and intensity. Even as Wagner troops reportedly ran out of ammunition, it seemed as though Shoigu was content to let them take the losses, while using his troops to secure the area. Ukraine has not given up easily though. It reinforced defenders around Bakhmut with special forces, who managed to grind the spring Russian offensive to a halt. Since Wagner was unable to launch major attacks against Ukraine from the center, it has allowed Ukrainian forces to reinforce their flanks and launch the deadly counterattacks, which continue today. Prigozhin has once again complained about all this on social media, and his outbursts are nearly intense enough to constitute treason against the state. He has claimed that regular Russian forces broke and ran at the first hint of a Ukrainian attack, blaming Shoigu for the current situation. But from Ukrainian sources on the ground, it appears as though many of the troops cutting and running may actually be Wagner units. Such reports seem to have angered Prigozhin enough that he has actually lashed out at Putin online, in ways which could be very bad for his health. In a recent broadcast following more losses at Bakhmut, he stated that the happy grandfather thinks that he is good. If he turns out to be right, then God may grant everyone health. But what will the country do? Our children, grandchildren, who are the future of Russia? And how can we win this war if, by chance, it turns out that this grandfather is a complete shithead? Putin is frequently referred to as Russia's grandfather, and Prigozhin seems to be directly attacking him in a way that no other Russian official has dared to do. Prigozhin quickly walked back his attack in later interviews, careful to state that many in Russian leadership could be called grandfather. But most likely the lashing out was a sign that Prigozhin is increasingly frustrated with the state of the war effort and blames Putin for the untenable situation. This is also likely to be one of the biggest issues Putin has yet faced, with his two top military leaders essentially sabotaging each other. The Russian offensive in Bakhmut has not been nearly as successful as it should have been. Just as Russia started to make headway against Ukraine, the supply issues and infighting may have doomed them once again. What's more, the actual prospect of victory in Bakhmut is essentially meaningless, as the city has never held any real strategic significance. Its only true value is political and ideological, as Putin sees Bakhmut as a symbol of his invasion's success, and losing it would undermine Russian support for the war effort. And Bakhmut is just one piece of the larger picture. This type of drama is playing out across the battle space in Ukraine, as different factions of the Russian military compete against each other for plunder and political influence. But we should remember that at least some of this insanity is by Putin's design, intended to make sure that no one faction can challenge him for dominance in Russia. And while hundreds of thousands of ordinary Russians have paid with their lives, the constant violence in Ukraine still seems far from the gilded halls of the Kremlin and Putin's vacation palaces. Even so, Putin knows that he has risked a lot in this conflict. As Hall points out, as to whether or not Putin will run out of something, willpower, ammunition, men, that he wants to send into the meat grinder, I would be surprised if Putin were to just say, okay, no, this is a big mistake, or I've gone too far, or we don't have enough resources. This is one of the significant problems with this, is where does Putin go from here? If he somehow gives up and surrenders, that's going to have negative implications for him back in Russia, but if he doesn't win, that will too, and it looks like he's not going to win. I'm glad I'm not in Vladimir Putin's position right now because he doesn't have a whole lot of space to work with. And in this latest stage of the war, Putin's troubles are increasing again. This time not even due to the incompetence of his own forces. The issue has to do with Ukraine's increasing access to long-range precision weaponry. Since the beginning of the conflict, Kyiv has been asking the West for more materiel, but they have been slow to materialize. It took months for the HIMARS missile system to be delivered. But once it was, Ukraine gained the ability to strike static targets several dozen miles away with deadly accuracy. And in the time since, the West seems to have become more receptive to handing over increasingly powerful weaponry. One of these is the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, capable of striking targets up to 190 miles away. If the US decides to give these or other similarly capable weapons to the Ukrainians, it will put many major Russian cities and military installations within striking distance. Similarly, the United Kingdom recently agreed to provide Kyiv with the Storm Shadow cruise missile. With sophisticated stealth capabilities and a range more than twice that of the HIMARS, the Storm Shadow will allow Ukraine to hit targets far behind enemy lines as the counter-offensive ramps up. UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace confirmed that some of these weapons are already in-country, meaning we will likely start to see their effects soon. The UK has over 900 Storm Shadows in its arsenal, meaning that a sizable number will arrive this summer. While Ukraine's government has vowed not to strike into Russia itself, There are signs that it already is using drone attacks and border incursions. It is a simple reality that Ukraine cannot win the war without destroying at least the Russian bases resupplying the front, and this will almost certainly require strikes inside Russia proper. The same may hold true for F-16s and other advanced fighter jets. As Hall has stated, remember a few months ago when they said, "We're not going to send tanks," so that has shifted. Will this be another thing that shifts? Perhaps some of it will depend on what happens on the ground in the next year. A final element of the war's trajectory is the possibility of more external intervention, some of which might favor Russia. If Ukraine continues striking deeply into Russian territory, some experts have argued that China may soon get involved. Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping remain tacit allies, and China would not like the idea that a smaller neighbor supplied by the West could strike inside its borders. This and the CCP's affinity for fellow authoritarian regimes makes their position something of a question mark. As Hall notes, the Chinese position is really interesting and very complicated. The Chinese have very long-term goals. They want to be the primary superpower economically and militarily within the next 50 years. But by the same token, they share a certain ideology with Russia, and that is that democracies are a threat to them. So how is China going to play a neutral, moderating position in this when it's pretty clear they're coming down on Russia's side? Clearly that helps Russia, so China is walking a really fine tightrope at this point. However, there is also the possibility that China will attempt to stay in Ukraine's good graces in order to offer economic assistance rebuilding the country through loans and development projects. This is the strategy that Xi has taken with his massive Belt and Road project, and if applied to Ukraine, could generate substantial leverage over the West. Hall argues that if China wants a future, it's going to have really good economic relations with the West, the EU, the United States, and other developed countries. And a relationship with Russia is mutually exclusive, so if I'm Russia, I'm probably thinking that over the long term, the Chinese are not necessarily going to be on our side. All these considerations will play into how the war changes course in the months ahead. Russia's disorganization under Putin, Ukraine's increasing military assistance from the West, and the potential for more external involvement will all shape how effective the Ukrainian counteroffensive is this summer. They will also determine the long-term prospects for peace, as any potential peace treaty will not emerge until one side is definitively crippled, or forced to make concessions by its citizens or allied nations. When the dust finally settles, one thing is clear: Russia and Ukraine will both be changed forever, all due to the greed and ambition of one man, Vladimir Putin. So will Hall's prediction for the war pan out, or will there be another major deciding factor in how things go this summer and beyond? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.